we're going to talk about the principle of non-contradiction. This is the first principle of reason because you need it in order to make any kind of assertion. Reason is to try to figure out what is and what is not. The principle of non-contradiction says that those two are not the same thing, and that's necessary if we're going to reason at all. Aristotle says that if someone denies the principle of non-contradiction, if they're going to be consistent, they ought to just not talk. They should act like a vegetable, he says, because you don't have a carrot that speaks. If someone denies the principle of non-contradiction, they should act like the carrot, because if they speak, their words are assuming that you can say that something is and is not, or that something is not and therefore it is not. So anyway, we'll see if that becomes clearer as we go along. The principle of non-contradiction. A thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. A thing. When we're talking about a thing, what I mean here is something that either exists or something that could possibly exist, not something that's a contradiction in terms, like a square circle that by definition cannot exist because a square and a circle are simply defined as different things, or a silent sound. Contradictions like that are not things that exist or that could possibly exist. And we're talking about the things that could exist or actually do. Cannot both be and not be. In other words, these two things are different, and you can't have them both at the same time. If there is an apple in front of me, then there's not an apple in front of me. If the apple's not in front of me, then that's the case, okay? And there's not that same apple is not simultaneously in front of me and not in front of me at the same time, which gets to the next step, which is at the same time. In other words, this apple can be in front of me right now, and in another minute not be in front of me. That's quite possible, but at the same time, both situations don't exist because they're contradictory to one another. Lastly, last part of this to explain, in the same respect. In the same respect means in exactly the same way. So sometimes we can confuse ourselves and make ourselves think that there's a contradiction when there's really not. And we do that because a lot of times we don't speak precisely. So with my hands, for example, my hand is moving. That's a true statement. Now, is it simultaneously true that my hand is not moving? Yes, actually, depending on which hand you're thinking of. So my right hand is moving, and my left hand is not moving. Therefore, I can say, in respect of my right hand, my hand is moving, and in respect of my left hand, my hand is not moving, and both of those are true at the same time. But it doesn't violate this principle because I'm not talking in the same respect. I'm talking about two different hands. I'm not talking in exactly the same way. So if I was being more precise, I could say my right hand is moving and my left hand is not moving, and it's clear that that is not contrary to the principle of non-contradiction. Another example, another way in which we might speak in a confusing way. Someone might ask me, do you have any fish? Now, I could say yes, and I could say no, but in two different ways. I could say yes because I own fish. I could say no because perhaps I took them to mean, are you holding a fish right now that you could hand to me? And that's not true. So I do have fish over there in Aquaria, but I don't have fish right in my hand. And it depends on how I understand their statement. So it can be true in different ways that I have a fish or don't have a fish. But if I'm talking about exactly the same way, it's one way or the other. It's not both simultaneously. That's the principle of non-contradiction. So that's why we've got to be careful as we think about things, that we recognize exactly what we're talking about so that we don't think that there are contradictions in places where they don't really exist. I'll give an example in regard to Christianity, or a couple of examples. Um, One understanding of the Catholic Church throughout the 2,000 years of our history is that faith and reason are not contradictory to one another, that faith's propositions are, if sometimes above reason, meaning I may not always understand fully how they work, they're not contradictions, and I can see that they're not contradictions. Sometimes people, there was something I was reading the other day, and the author, I thought, in a way, it was in a pretty good book, but I think the author just doesn't really know Christianity. And he brought up a rather large set of things that he thought were contradictions within Christianity. Now, I don't think any of them were, but you have to understand them in terms of the right respect. So I'll give a couple of examples. He talked a couple times in a couple ways about the incarnation, about the eternal becoming in time, or the infinite becoming finite. Christian tradition sees that as as certainly not a contradiction, because our understanding is that God, the eternal and infinite, doesn't change to become finite. Rather, he takes to himself a human nature, and that human nature, the human nature of Jesus, the human nature of the Son of God, is finite in time, but there's no change to the infinite God, because there's the changes in this is in the human nature that he takes from the womb of Mary. So according to his divine nature, he's eternal and infinite. According to his human nature, he is finite and in time, but it's in two different respects, not in the same respect, and in that way does not violate the principle of non-contradiction. Another example that is raised in the book and by people is the Trinity. Now, I'll admit that the Trinity, I don't understand in what way God is one and three fully, as if I could totally parse that out. But I can say it's not contrary to the principle of non-contradiction, because the way that the doctrine is stated is in a way where it's not saying that a thing can both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. So the doctrine of the Trinity is that there's one God who is three divine persons. But that's two different things, you see, God and persons. It would be a contradiction if I said there is one God who is simultaneously three gods, or there is one person who is simultaneously three persons. But that's not the Christian doctrine. The doctrine is that God is in one respect one, as God, and in another respect three, as persons. And if we don't fully understand what way that is so, well, goodness, there's all sorts of things, even in the natural world, that we don't fully understand, but that we can recognize are not contrary to the principle of non-contradiction. And I would say very true as well in things that are divine. So, the principle of non-contradiction, a thing cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. And it's important for us to not be too quick to throw out the idea that things are contradictions, because first we need to recognize in what respect people are talking. Is there really a contradiction in something that somebody says or some claim that's being made, or do they understand things in two different respects in a way that makes it not a contradiction? So that's something to be attentive to in learning to be a good conversation partner, because then you can understand what the other person is really saying, rather than just kind of running to the conclusion, the sort of straw man idea that it's a contradiction when it's not. Nevertheless, sometimes things are contradictory, and we need to recognize those as well. Have a great day. God bless you, and talk to you soon.